blood everywhere. God, that was so much blood. I knew I was done.
You know she was dead.
She was dead. I didn't want to hurt her.
You what?
I didn't want to hurt her. I really did. I didn't want to hurt her. I made so many mistakes. I made so many. And I'm usually so calm.
Responders are called to a car fire near the 22-mile marker of I-96. The body of a 37-year-old woman identified as Lori Marie Vargas, trapped and badly burned inside. At first, it seemed like a deadly, fiery crash, but evidence at the scene, along with the man officers found walking near the crash, quickly leading detectives to believe this case was something else. Police online records show 45-year-old Donald Spice is being held.
Make you a little more comfortable with taking those handcuffs off. Need anything? Want a cup of coffee? Regular decaf. Or they want some regular, huh? So what's your relationship with Lori?
Up until Sunday, I was her fiance, and Sunday it seemed like all hell broke loose.
So tell me about that.
So I went home. I got a text from Lori. She thought I was leaving her. She felt I was not happy, even though I did not know I'd given any indication I wasn't. It was basically, I'm leaving you before you can leave me because I seen in your eyes you were disappointed.
So from a psychological defenses perspective, we would say that is projection, because he's attributing to her attitudes that he in fact holds himself. I don't think he really was totally happy in the relationship at all. He's very calm. He refers to it in the past tense, that I was her fiance, and he's beginning to set the stage that things were kind of fine with me, but something was wrong with her.
I cried on the way. I'm trying to replay different things in my head, like, well, you know, am I not being supportive? Was I not doing enough? She was bipolar. On a dime, she'll switch.
I didn't believe it, not because he said he cried. I didn't believe it because he presents Lori Vargas as this crazy woman who is out of control with her emotions. He says she's irrational, which many abusive men do.
The technique of blaming somebody else for what's going on is very common in people who have psychopathy. This behavior is definitely related to power and control, and it's related to obtaining their objective.
Okay.
Okay, buddy, just...
Yes. Just a second. That was my captain. He gave more information from this stuff, so I know Lori is deceased, and it's not from the fire that I know of. She was murdered. And I'm speaking to the person I believe murdered her. How did it go so wrong? You what?
I didn't want to hurt her. I really did. I didn't want to hurt her.
He just says, I didn't want to hurt her. I believe that part, but I think he wanted to kill her. His own thinking was, I want to get rid of her, but maybe I didn't want to make her suffer.
When you go into the house, what goes on in your head?
I walk in, I go around, I see that she took stuff. She destroyed the pictures we had together. It doesn't sound like much, but it was our moments. First thing she says was, "You lied to me." It's like, are you kidding me? And I knew she was already gone.
That's what we would call the Freudian slip. That, I believe, indicates he knew she's already dead. He's already killed her. Little phrases and lines make it sound like, in the eye of the investigator, that this was hurtful to him.
What did you do?
We were in the kitchen. That's when she picked up Chico. And then she moved into the bedroom. And when she grabbed Chico, it was just... There was figure stuff out quick.
She was gonna take Chico with her?
No, she picked him up to kill him. Oh, because she hates that little dog. And I love that little dog. I'm sorry. It was just a breaking point.
I'm a little bit speechless at the pointlessness of this detail. The story, as is told, makes no sense. A woman with no history of violence, no history of volatility, would not pick up a knife and threaten a dog. Sometimes people say things that they actually thought and they attribute it to the other person. So I wonder if he picked up Chico to kill the dog, to show her that he meant business. Psychopaths often do. They torture animals. They keep pets and they torture them. It's horrific. And perhaps he threatened to kill the dog, which abusive men often do, to show that they mean business.
This is an appeal to pity. There is a cultural norm in our society that you're a good person if you're good to a dog. Dogs are our friends. Dogs are wonderful. And it's a bad person who would threaten to kill a dog or mistreat a dog. Donald Spice's presentation of the story, it adds to the element that she's evil, he's good. She's an evil person. He's essentially saying she picks up the dog and says, you know, I'm gonna kill this thing, and then the murder happens. I think it's all setting the stage for what's about to come. I think it is manipulative.
What did you strike her with?
I think a 2-pound hammer.
So when she grabbed Chico, is that when you grabbed for the hammer?
I just picked it right up and I dropped it right down on her.
She was standing?
Yeah, because we were redoing the windows. It was just right there. And I think it was just one motion.
Did you try to defend that, or did you not see it coming?
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm not bragging, but I can be fast. I swung it like it was an iron. I'm actually surprised it didn't go right through her head. Because I swear it felt like it lifted me right off my feet.
You usually say it's love that sweeps you off your feet, but in this case, it's a hammer. There is an element of the dramatic, but I do think that that's part of what happens when people are telling a story that's just not true. In reality, it's very likely she was asleep in the bed or in a position of helplessness at the time, but it's implied he's saving the dog from her.
There's blood everywhere. God, there was so much blood. I knew I was done.
You know she was dead.
She was dead. There was a gasp. And when I moved her, there was no heartbeat. There was no anything. There was so much blood. I didn't even know I hit her that hard.
Blood makes a lot of people with core psychopathic features feel alive. While he's not visibly showing a lot of emotion, the kind of details he provides really makes you feel like he's enjoying describing it.
I made so many mistakes. I made so many. And I'm usually so calm. I grabbed the blanket off the, I can't even think of the word. I don't know how long I sat there with Lori in my arms. I couldn't even begin to judge. And then everything was a bad dash. Everything.
How did you pick her up?
I got it on the comforter. And then you just pull the comforter. And it just slides along. All you gotta do is just slide her in.
Is that in the passenger seat?
Yeah. I wiped her face off. I put the hoodie up. I got out of the driveway as quick as possible. I went driving. I had to tell her how sorry I was.
Why on earth he would put her in the passenger seat and drive around? Well, a polite way to put it is it's downright peculiar. Perhaps he wanted to have a corpse next to him and get the thrill of driving around with a dead body. That would have been no thrill if he put her in the trunk. He enjoyed deceiving everybody along the way.
He was able to do that, didn't seem terribly emotionally distressed over that. He's describing it with relative calm, which is all not normal. Psychopaths don't have the same connectivity to other people. Other people are objects, they're things, and they can depersonalize them rather quickly. And so now that she's dead, she's gone. I think in his mind at that particular point, this was on the way to achieving his ultimate goal.
We got a joint bank account because Lori couldn't have a bank account. I found out that she owes close to $70,000.
You married in 7 months. Is that $70,000 a concern to you?
Yeah, that's like, I mean,
That's
it's
a big deal.
Big
Oh, yeah.
deal.
Donald Spice is so comfortable in a courtroom, he actually stopped for a chat about his case, the third of his criminal career.
It's the third time of being really stupid. It was desperation.
Apparently, Spice is a pretty desperate person. He's been here before, though he was a bit shyer 6 years ago. This video is from his 1991 case. Spice was actually on a tether for a previous B&E when he burglarized the Profile Salon on Alpine. That same night, Spice hit the Alpine Superwash, ended up back behind bars, and yes, the cycle began again. Spice served 5 years before getting out last July and immediately trying to break into another business.
Having problems getting money, borrowing money.
But police say it's not about money. Spice is just addicted to breaking and entering.
No, I am not that. The police are trying to make me out to be a obsessive person.
I think he is obsessive. I think he plans and plots and schemes. It's a pattern that he will engage in over and over and over again, that he's not going to stop. What Donald Spice is obsessed with is the excitement and the winning. It's setting out a plan and beating other people at something. There's a progression of the intensity of the crime so that he could have more of a thrill and a bigger gain.
I've only been out of prison since 2012. I worked my off, and now, and I can't say it's for nothing, because at least I gave. A little light of himself to the girls. And then I'm the person that killed her.
You put her car in the ditch.
Yeah. Yeah, I used the lighter. My, this one. Okay. I throw the gas can. The car is. It's burning. And then there's an explosion. I just walked.
Spice was not interested in Lori Vargas as a beautiful, sensual woman. I believe he was setting up the murder from the start. Psychopaths are frequently predators. And so he likely looked for someone he thought he could fool, he thought he could con, he thought he could seduce, importantly, and then later on murder in a way that he thought he could get away with.
Lori Vargas was a mother of two. She would fall potentially into a category of people who'd be more vulnerable, especially she's working as a single mother. That pattern fits a targeting pattern that many psychopaths and sociopaths have. The irony is that although they don't attach as profoundly to other people as healthy people do, they know who needs to feel an attachment.
I thought about losing her body. But I didn't want her kids ever questioning, is mom gonna come through that door? I thought that'd be more cruel. Especially to the girls, at least they know there's closure.
Yeah, I don't think he's sorry at all. Donald Spice is framing his actions as something that are kind. I'm really not a monster. I do kind things. I see that as the selfish manipulation of the image he's trying to convey to the police officer, try and get maybe a little empathy. The problem is that he sucks at it.
So he's progressing to the end goal, but along that progress are all of these little things that are horrific for us, but that give him pleasure. So the seduction, the killing, then the staging of the killing, and then he explodes the car and he gets pleasure from probably the sheer violence of it, but also that's part of the storyline that is created for himself.
Today, prosecutors laid out evidence suggesting the murder was pre-planned. They say months before the murder, someone used Spice's credit card and his computer to purchase a life insurance policy on Lori Vargas. They say Spice was listed as the sole beneficiary. Spice refuted the evidence presented today.
They don't have to prove that. They have to allege it. That's it. That's good enough. I'm guilty until proven innocent. I'm standing here in cuffs and shackles.
He sounds annoyed. He sounds angry, which is probably the most genuine emotion that we've seen from him. He's even lower on empathy than I imagine. What we see now is the ruthless planning. Lori Vargas's murder is part of a long continuum of
Ontario Provincial Police, where's your emergency?
He came in the house with a gun. My sister's screaming and she's lying on the ground.
Everything was as if it was a play. Carl opened the door. Anastasia walked right out the door. I walked in the house. I opened the door and Natalie's right there. It was like as if it was supposed to be. I am innocent. I done nothing wrong.
A deadly rampage that crisscrossed the picturesque Madawaska Valley in eastern Ontario. Early in the morning, a gunman drove to 3 different communities, killing 3 women.
A bit closer, making the arrest. Got you. We're on him, we're just cuffing him now.
Can you please confirm this is Basil?
Basil Palutsky.
10-4.
Really, all I want to know is, what's your understanding of why we're here right now, Basil?
You're here trying to get me to say something to incriminate me in any way you possibly can.
The 3 individuals that were murdered are Carol Culleton, Anastasia Kuziak, and Natalie Warmerdam. Now, obviously, as of right now, you have been arrested for murder, okay? So, if you'd like to phone a lawyer.
For killing, not murder. I didn't murder anybody.
What's the difference between killing and murder?
That was shell, not murder. Commandments.
And I believe it's actually thou shalt not kill.
You're wrong, you better start reading the Bible.
Yeah?
Yeah. Find an old version before they changed it. Mine only was also murder, that's all I mean. It's murder, kill somebody that's innocent.
So, in terms of Carol and Anastasia and Natalie, would you say you killed them or murdered them?
I killed them because they were not innocent. They were guilty. I was innocent. I done nothing wrong in God's eyes.
This is a guy who likes to think that he is a good Christian and that he is a good person and these people who wrong him are bad people. It's a very, I think, unconvincing, I'm a good guy, I'm the victim presentation. One thing that approaches psychopathy with it is it's really lacking in awareness that no one's really gonna buy his sob story.
He's just trying to rationalize and justify his actions in a way that make moral sense, but it's not at all believable.
So he's also showing this kind of very, I think, superficial anguish, this emotion. He reminds me of any number of men who've been kicked out of their girlfriend or wife's houses, usually girlfriends, where they have a little parasitic relationship with a girlfriend. The girlfriend finally kicks him out and they show up in a psychiatric emergency room saying they're suicidal, trying to basically get out of trouble. And they present in this real, like, I'm such a victim, things are so hard for me. And it's usually pretty transparent. And I think that's one of the interesting things for him is he's kind of out of touch with his audience. He's not a very good psychopath, and that he's not able to manipulate people well. It's hard to watch him and not feel anger towards him, or if you've been doing this for a while, almost like amusement at how poorly he's executing it.
When you woke up, what can you remember about that?
I left around 8 o'clock. I was beside myself, like I was looking at this from over there. I could see myself.
What did you see yourself doing?
Walking from the house to the car. I believe that God was telling me where to turn, because I was driving on roads that I didn't even know where they were going. And I was wondering, what the hell am I doing here? And then in a bunch of little towns.
It felt as if God was telling me. So it's kind of distancing language. He's not really coming close to taking responsibility and certainly not feeling remorse.
He believes he has a special relationship with God. It's his ego talking, that he is special, he's a chosen one, that he is above the rest of us in his ability to decide who dies and who lives.
Drove in, and I remember thinking that God is really helping me, because when I went to Carl walked right outside. I said, "Why do you hate me?" And then she closed the door. I was right there. And then I broke the window with my elbow. And I reached in and I unlocked the door. And she said, "This is not you, babe. This is not you." You know what? Then she told me that her new boyfriend, Dave, was coming over because the hydro was out. And I said, "You're lying to me again." And there was a cable TV coil. I picked it up and I hit her with it and I wrapped it around her head. And she just kept saying, "This is not you, Basil, this is not you." But that doesn't mean I wasn't doing that. I see myself doing that. Doesn't make sense. I was over there. I'm here. I'm like a camera, and as if I was watching with a camera. myself.
He talks about watching himself on camera. I think that's also part of his own narcissism. You know, look at what I did. Particularly the more psychopathic somebody is and the more narcissistic somebody is, watching themselves is really an ultimate honor.
In fact, I went crazy, didn't I? And I wasn't putting up with no more. I thought I'm gonna shoot the leave me alone.
So how long have you known Carol for?
Approximately 3 years. Before,
And are you in a relationship with her?
yes. I told her, you asked me to do stuff for you, and then when I do it, you tell me that I wasn't supposed to do it. She was, I don't think bipolar, they tell you just to make the mind, you keep changing your mind.
Basil Barutsky, when you pay attention to his crimes and what he's done, is very classically a chronic domestic violence perpetrator. He's a misogynist, and he's a psychopath. He has a difficult time not getting his way. He has a complete lack of respect for women and sees them as objects. He is devoid of typical emotion and attachment to people. He has a history of stalking Carol, of showing up at her home unannounced, showing up to do work on her property that she didn't ask for, and while she's not there. Here's an excerpt from a letter that Barutsky wrote Carol. I'm a deep thinker. I worry about the world, the planet, the people, the pollution. That's me. I can't change me. I am a loving, caring human being. I am a good person. He's trying to convince her that he's this horribly misunderstood person. And you see that time and time again with domestic violence. Perpetrators justify their own rage. If you would just behave, I wouldn't need to do this to you.
So on Monday, I was at the cottage, and that's when Carol was, that's when she said that her and her man called me BF. She told me that they had this joke about me being BF, best friend, the guy that would do anything. She said that they thought it was funny, and she was laughing in the house.
Certainly, knowing that people are joking about him, it's very challenging to his ego. It's a challenge to his masculinity, his role as a provider, his sexual potency. He's not a competitor anymore. He's not a romantic competitor. He's your old BF. He's your friend. He is not somebody to be threatened by. I can imagine that being intensely threatening to him. And so that's that kind of egotistical, self-centered component that you might see in psychopathy.
My guess would be when he killed Carol, he actually felt good. He felt a release of the rage, humiliation, shame.
I remember driving the car. I'm outside the door. And I remember God's helping me do what's right. God's making this easy. Because when I got to Anastasia, she walked out the door. Wasn't even at the door, she just walked out. I asked Anastasia, I just said, why did you lie in court? And she said, I didn't. It was as if it was supposed to be. She turned around and walked in, I walked right in behind her, and the gun went off. There was a little island, and she was standing, and she just went down, and the gun went off after she went down.
Barutsky was convicted back in 2014 of assault and for attempting to choke, suffocate, or strangle Anastasia Cusick, along with the charge of mischief for burning her property. He spent nearly 2 years in prison.
I wasn't guilty. Because it just lies. I sat in jail for a whole year, robbing like a dog, knowing that all I did was read the Bible. It's red, 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 red. Gotta be trapped, punched out. Because old guys like me that are crippled, you're a mark, you're fun for all. That's a cruel place, man. I never hit that woman. Anastasia beat the out of me. She burned all my clothes. She burned my boots. She burned everything. Oh, I kept that house from burning down so fast. She was gonna throw a can of acid. She was crazy. She's bipolar.
He believes every woman in his life is bipolar. That's what he's talking about with the 3 victims. And ultimately, what he's really doing is trying to discredit them. He's trying to say, don't believe them, they're irrational. Barutsky's blaming the victim, things that he's responsible for, actions that he ultimately was proven in a court of law to have done. He now assigns to her. His narrative of his history is that he was wrongfully convicted, he was wrongfully sent to jail. What we know in public record is that Barutsky served 2 years in prison for seriously assaulting Anastasia.
There was another girl there. She had toothbrush in her mouth. She said, who are you? I said, I'll kill you. And that's all. And the gun went off. I said, God, what do I do now? I'll only get in the car and drive down the highway. And then kill her. Whose farm is this? It wasn't anything that was. It's not because she lied.
What happened when you went to Natalie's farm on Tuesday?
What happened? I just drove in, walked in the door. She was sitting there. She went in the corner, I followed her. Go, walk her. That's it.
What happened at Natalie's?
I asked a question. And as soon as I asked the question, she lied. And that's what is just like lie bang.
Next thing you know, the police are there and I'm in charge of it, threatening to hang him when all they
I said is, if you don't smarten up, I'll string you up. Meaning, listen, kid, do I deserve to go to jail for that? No. 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 So she used the system. Oh, thing is so stupid.
One thing that abusers often do that terrifies women is they threaten their children. They try to figure out the best way to manipulate, control, and get obedience and submission from the woman. So it's about control. And if he's not gaining enough control, then you hit where it hurts the most. And for mothers, it's the child, so he threatens the safety of her son.
Ultimately, his narrative of this, once again, is that he's misunderstood. And that Natalie is actually to blame. She's the manipulative person. Natalie made the decision that any protective parent would, which was to pursue charges, to use the legal system to help protect her.
So what did these women do to you that made you have to kill them? That's the burning question of the day.
I was put in jail twice, wrongfully. All because you believe the lies.
Use police, and then take the lies and you project them to the courts. Use the police, because yous have attacked me. Yous are the end, over, over, over.
He's full of self-pity and consistent deflection of responsibility and blaming everyone else for his actions. He's always the victim. This kind of manipulation and minimization and denial and twisting of reality is very, very common in domestic abusers, but it is also a psychopathic trait.
How do you feel about what's happened to these women, Basil? How do you feel right now? Not at the time is what I'm getting at. Right now, me and you in this room,
Empty. Empty.
Barutsky is a psychopath, and that's what you expect to see in somebody who's a psychopath. He doesn't spend a lot of time taking responsibility for his own behavior. Affect and emotions are shallow, he's impulsive, and he doesn't lose a whole lot of sleep over that.
do you understand how what's happened to these three women is wrong?
Yeah. When I asked Anastasia, why did you lie? Why couldn't she just have said, I'm sorry? I'm sure now I would have stopped. That would have been enough. I love that woman, body.
He likes to view himself, I think, as being a good person, even though all the evidence is to the contrary. And when that's questioned, he responds really angrily. He likes to kind of drink his own Kool-Aid. His Kool-Aid is, I'm a good person, and I'm the victim here.
A guilty verdict was handed down in the brutal murders of Carol Culleton, Anastasia Kuzik, and Natalie Warmadam that had so many warning signs.
Barutsky represented himself during the trial, refusing to utter a single word or ask a single question, despite being given multiple opportunities. Then, on the final day, with the jury absent, Barutsky called the judge a liar.
There are crimes that shock a community. And then there are crimes that leave a wound so deep that years later, people still struggle to speak about them without lowering their voices. In March of 2019, A small coastal settlement on New Zealand's North Island became the backdrop for one of the most disturbing child murder cases the country had seen in recent memory. The place was quiet. The kind of place where people knew one another's names. The kind of place where children played close to home and where the sea seemed to stretch endlessly beyond the horizon. Nothing about that landscape suggested horror. Nothing about the gentle tides moving through the estuary suggested that beneath the surface, a secret was waiting. A secret involving a little girl who was only 2 years old. Her name was Nevaeh Aja. At that age, the world is still made of simple things. Tiny footsteps across a living room floor. A favorite toy dragged from room to room. The sound of laughter arriving unexpectedly and disappearing just as quickly. Children that young do not understand danger. They do not understand betrayal. And they certainly do not understand why the people they trust most are supposed to protect them. Yet in the story you are about to hear, the greatest threat did not come from a stranger lurking in the shadows. It did not come from a predator watching from afar. It came from inside the circle that should have been safest. The place every child instinctively turns toward when frightened. Home. When reports first emerged that a young child had gone missing in the Bay of Plenty region, concern spread rapidly through the community. A missing toddler is every parent's nightmare. The possibilities race through people's minds immediately. Perhaps she wandered away. Perhaps someone saw her and took her somewhere safe. Perhaps there had been a misunderstanding. Perhaps she would be found within hours. Communities often cling to hope during those first moments. Hope is easier than accepting the alternative. Searches begin. Questions are asked. Phones ring. People volunteer. Every minute matters. Every sighting becomes important. Every rumor feels like a lead. But as time passed, something about this case felt different. Something felt wrong. Not merely tragic. Wrong. The kind of wrong that settles in the pit of your stomach before you can explain why. Investigators began looking closer. Family members were questioned. Timelines were reconstructed. Movements were examined. Stories were compared. The routine steps of an investigation slowly unfolded. At first glance, it appeared to be another missing child case. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were already beginning to appear. Tiny inconsistencies. Details that did not align. Pieces that refused to fit together. And as those pieces accumulated, a darker possibility emerged. The possibility that Nevaeh had not simply disappeared. The possibility that someone already knew exactly what had happened to her. Some crimes reveal themselves quickly. Others resist discovery. They hide behind lies, confusion, and misdirection. This case would become a battle between truth and deception. A battle that would eventually expose a reality so disturbing that even experienced investigators struggled to comprehend it. Because when the evidence finally came into focus, it painted a picture far removed from the hopeful search for a missing child. It revealed violence. It revealed suffering. And it revealed a betrayal that many people found almost impossible to understand. The details that emerged in court would horrify an entire nation. Medical experts would describe injuries covering the small body of a 2-year-old child. Not one injury. Not several. Dozens. Evidence of repeated violence inflicted upon someone completely defenseless. Someone who could not fight back. Someone who depended entirely on the adults around her. As prosecutors later reconstructed the final chapter of Nevaeh's life, the image that emerged was one of unimaginable vulnerability. A child facing terror she could not understand. A child trapped in circumstances beyond her control. A child whose story would force New Zealand to confront difficult questions about addiction, family violence, mental health, and the systems designed to protect the most vulnerable members of society. The public response was immediate. People searched for explanations. Many searched for reasons. Some searched for warning signs that might have been missed. Others simply asked the question that often follows crimes involving children. How? How could this happen? How could anyone look at a 2-year-old child and choose violence? How could a life so small become the center of such immense cruelty? The answers would not be simple. In fact, they would become one of the most fiercely contested aspects of the case. The man at the center of the investigation would later claim that drugs had shattered his mind. That methamphetamine use had pushed him into a state where he no longer understood reality. That he could not remember what happened. That he was not responsible in the way prosecutors claimed. Those arguments would eventually become a central battleground inside the courtroom. But before jurors heard expert testimony, before lawyers presented competing narratives, before a judge handed down a sentence that would echo across the country, there was a little girl. A little girl whose life began long before headlines appeared. A little girl who never chose to become the subject of national news. A little girl whose name would eventually become known throughout New Zealand for the worst possible reason. And there was also a community that would be forced to confront the reality that evil does not always arrive wearing a recognizable face. Sometimes it looks ordinary. Sometimes it hides behind familiar relationships. Sometimes it exists where people least expect to find it. Years later, court records would document the facts. Investigators would map the timeline. Experts would analyze the evidence. Judges would explain the law. But none of those documents could fully capture the emotional weight left behind by the case. Because beyond every exhibit, every photograph, every forensic report, and every courtroom argument was a child who never had the opportunity to grow up. A child who would never attend school. Never celebrate another birthday. Never discover who she might have become. The future that should have stretched decades ahead had been erased before it truly began. And that is perhaps what makes this story so difficult. Not merely the violence. Not merely the crime. But the scale of what was lost. A lifetime reduced to a brief chapter. A voice silenced before it had fully formed. A family forever marked by a tragedy that could never be undone. As investigators dug deeper into the mystery of Nevaeh Ager's disappearance, they would uncover a sequence of events more disturbing than anyone initially imagined. What began as concern for a missing child would transform into a murder investigation. What appeared to be uncertainty would become evidence. What began with questions would end with answers. Answers that shocked an entire nation. Answers that would reveal one of the darkest child homicide cases in modern New Zealand history. Tonight, we follow that path. From the quiet coastline of Bay of Plenty, to the desperate search for a missing toddler, to the discovery that changed everything. This is the story of Nevaeh Ager, and the horrifying truth hidden behind her disappearance. To understand how this story unfolded, it is necessary to leave behind the courtroom for a moment. Leave behind the headlines, the police reports, the forensic evidence, and the arguments that would eventually dominate national attention. Before there was a murder investigation, before there was a missing child, before an entire country learned the name Nevaeh Ager, there was a place. A place that, on the surface, seemed almost incapable of producing a story like this. The Bay of Plenty stretches along the northeastern coastline of New Zealand's North Island. It is a region known for its beauty. Rolling green hills descend toward sparkling water. Long stretches of coastline curve around quiet communities. Fishing boats drift across harbors at sunrise. Tourists arrive to admire beaches, coastal walks, and the slower pace of life that many city dwellers dream about but rarely experience. There is a sense of openness there. The sky feels larger. The roads feel quieter. The horizon seems endless. For many people, it is a place associated with family holidays, warm summers, and peaceful living. Yet like every community in the world, the postcard image only tells part of the story. Behind every beautiful landscape are real people carrying real burdens. Financial stress. Family conflict. Addiction. Mental health struggles. Broken relationships. Generational trauma. These realities often exist unseen, hidden behind closed doors and ordinary appearances. And in small communities, those struggles can become both more visible and more invisible at the same time. Everyone knows each other. Everyone hears rumors. Everyone notices changes. Yet there is also a tendency to mind one's own business, to avoid becoming involved, to assume someone else is already helping, to hope that what appears troubling from a distance is not as serious as it seems. Nestled within the Bay of Plenty region is Makatu, a small coastal settlement with deep historical significance and strong ties to local Maori communities. At first glance, Makatu feels timeless. The ocean is never far away. The smell of salt drifts through the air. The tide shapes daily life much as it has for generations. People grow up surrounded by water, fishing, family gatherings, and the rhythms of a close-knit community. It is the kind of place where stories travel quickly. The kind of place where neighbors recognize familiar vehicles. The kind of place where unusual events rarely remain secret for long. Yet even in communities where people know one another, darkness can still find room to grow. Sometimes the most dangerous situations are not hidden by distance. They are hidden by familiarity. People become accustomed to dysfunction. Arguments become normal. Chaos becomes expected. Warning signs become part of the background. And over time, what should trigger alarm instead becomes something people simply learn to live around. The story of Nevaeh Aja unfolded within that complicated reality. The contrast between the environment and the crime would later become one of the most haunting aspects of the case. Because when outsiders imagined the place where the tragedy occurred, many pictured a peaceful coastal settlement surrounded by natural beauty. And they were correct. But beauty alone cannot protect children. Beautiful places still contain troubled households. Beautiful places still contain addiction. Beautiful places still contain violence. The tragedy that would later unfold was not born from the landscape. It emerged from human choices, human failures, and circumstances that had been building long before March of 2019. By the time Nevaeh entered the world, countless factors were already shaping the environment around her. Many true crime stories focus on a single moment. A single decision. A single act of violence. But those moments rarely appear from nowhere. More often, they emerge from a long chain of events stretching backward through months or years. The final tragedy becomes visible because it is catastrophic. The warning signs are often less visible because they accumulate slowly. One bad decision becomes another. A relationship deteriorates. Drug use escalates. Financial pressures increase. Trust erodes. Responsibilities are neglected. Each step may appear survivable on its own. Yet together they create conditions that become increasingly unstable. According to evidence later presented in court, methamphetamine would become a major factor in the story. Methamphetamine has left deep scars across numerous communities in New Zealand. Its impact extends far beyond the individual user. Families suffer. Children suffer. Relationships collapse. Financial resources disappear. Violence often increases. Paranoia becomes common. Reality itself can become distorted. The drug's influence can be devastating. Users frequently experience periods of intense agitation, sleeplessness, irrational thinking, and emotional instability. In severe cases, prolonged use can contribute to psychotic symptoms and extreme behavioral changes. Communities across New Zealand have spent years grappling with these consequences. Entire families have been affected. Children are often among the most vulnerable victims. Not because they use the drug themselves, but because they live within the environments shaped by it. Children depend entirely on adults. They cannot choose safer circumstances. They cannot leave dangerous homes. They cannot recognize risks the way adults can. Their safety rests completely in the hands of those responsible for them. When those adults become consumed by addiction, the consequences can be devastating. By early 2019, circumstances surrounding Nevaeh's life had become increasingly fragile. The details revealed later in court painted a picture far removed from the idealized image of childhood many people imagine. Instead of stability, there were growing concerns. Instead of security, there were signs of chaos. Instead of protection, There were dangers gathering beneath the surface. Yet from the outside, many of those dangers remained invisible. That is often what makes cases involving young children so difficult to comprehend after the fact. People look backward searching for obvious signs. Searching for a clear moment when intervention could have changed everything. Searching for a warning so unmistakable that action should have been inevitable. Reality is rarely that simple. Life unfolds in fragments. Information arrives incompletely. Concerns emerge gradually. People may suspect something is wrong without understanding how serious the situation truly is. And sometimes, by the time the full picture becomes clear, it is already too late. The months leading up to March 2019 existed within that uncertainty. The future tragedy had not yet occurred. No murder investigation existed. No national headlines had appeared. No courtroom testimony had been given. Life continued as normal for most people living in the region. Children attended school. Parents went to work. Fishing boats left harbor before dawn. Families gathered for meals. The ocean tides continued their endless cycle. Nothing about the natural world suggested that one of the country's most heartbreaking child homicide cases was approaching. If someone had stood along the shoreline during those weeks, watching waves roll toward the coast beneath a calm evening sky, they would have seen beauty. Nothing more. The future remained hidden. That hidden future is one of the most unsettling elements of crimes like this. Disaster often approaches quietly. There is no dramatic warning. No sudden announcement. No visible countdown. Life simply continues until the moment everything changes. And when that moment arrives, people often find themselves looking backward, realizing they were standing at the edge of a catastrophe without ever recognizing it. For Nevaeh, those final weeks represented the closing chapter of a life that had barely begun. She was only 2 years old. An age defined by discovery. An age filled with first words, growing curiosity, and rapid development. Children that age are learning about the world every day. Every object becomes interesting. Every experience becomes new. The future stretches infinitely ahead. At least, it should. Yet while Nevaeh experienced childhood through the limited understanding of a toddler, the adults around her were navigating a far more complicated reality. Adult problems. Adult decisions. Adult failures. The kind of problems children can neither understand nor escape. Those realities existed alongside ordinary life. A child might laugh one moment while chaos brews nearby. A child might play with a toy while adults argue in another room. A child might seek comfort from someone struggling with addiction, anger, or instability. Children cannot distinguish between safe environments and dangerous ones. They simply adapt to whatever world surrounds them. And that world would soon become the focus of intense police scrutiny. Investigators would eventually reconstruct timelines, examine relationships, review movements, analyze evidence. Every detail would matter. Every hour would matter. Every interaction would matter. But at this point in our story, none of that had happened yet. The storm remained invisible. Makatu continued to exist as it always had. The estuaries reflected the changing sky. The coastal winds moved through quiet streets. The sea carried on without concern for human tragedy. Nature remained indifferent. That indifference would later become one of the most haunting images connected to the case. Because somewhere beyond the houses, beyond the roads, beyond the ordinary routines of daily life, lay waterways that had witnessed generations come and go. Waterways that seemed peaceful. Waterways that looked harmless. Waterways that would eventually become part of a crime scene. At the time, however, nobody knew what role those waters would play. Nobody knew that investigators would soon search desperately for answers. Nobody knew that a little girl's disappearance would transform an entire community. Nobody knew that national attention was approaching. The future still existed as possibility. Hope still existed. Questions had not yet replaced certainty. Fear had not yet replaced routine. But beneath the calm surface of everyday life, Forces were already moving toward collision. Addiction, instability, violence, secrecy, all of them converging toward a moment that would permanently alter countless lives. And when March 2019 finally arrived, the quiet coastal settlement of Makatu would find itself at the center of a tragedy so disturbing that years later it would still be remembered across New Zealand. The peaceful setting remained the same. The ocean remained the same. The tides remained the same. But the story hidden within that landscape was about to emerge. And once it did, nothing would ever look quite the same again. In many true crime cases, the victim risks becoming a secondary character in their own story. The investigation becomes the focus. The suspect dominates the headlines. Courtroom arguments fill newspaper columns. Experts debate evidence. Lawyers challenge timelines. And gradually, the person at the center of the tragedy begins to disappear beneath the weight of the crime itself. That is especially true in cases involving very young children. They leave behind fewer photographs, fewer recorded memories, fewer personal stories. They never have the opportunity to tell the world who they are. Their identities become frozen in time, forever remembered at the age they were when their lives ended. For Nevaeh Ager, that age was just 2 years old. 2 years. A span of time so short that most adults can barely remember their own lives at that stage. Yet within those 2 years existed an entire world. A small world, certainly. But no less meaningful. No less important. No less deserving of protection. When people hear that a child was only 2 years old, the number itself can feel abstract. 2 years sounds brief. Simple. Almost insignificant. But childhood does not measure time the same way adults do. For a toddler, 2 years contains everything. It contains every first experience. Every first smile. Every first step. Every first word. Every discovery. Every lesson. Every moment spent learning that the world can be trusted. Children that age live almost entirely in the present. They do not worry about next year. They do not think about the distant future. Their universe is made up of familiar faces, familiar voices, familiar places. A favorite blanket. A favorite toy. A familiar room. The sound of someone calling their name. The comfort of being picked up when frightened. The reassurance that the adults around them will keep them safe. Those expectations are not taught. They are instinctive. Children are born believing that the people closest to them are protectors. It is one of the most fundamental relationships in human life. The bond between parent and child forms the foundation upon which everything else is built. Safety. Trust. Attachment. Security. For most children, those things become invisible because they are consistently present. Like air. Like sunlight. Like gravity. Children assume protection exists because it always has. They do not imagine a world where it doesn't. And that is part of what makes crimes against young children so difficult to process. The violation extends beyond physical harm. It shatters one of the most basic expectations of human existence. The expectation that adults will safeguard those who cannot protect themselves. By all accounts, Nevaeh was at an age where curiosity dominated everyday life. Toddlers explore constantly. Every object becomes interesting. Every room becomes an adventure. Every discovery feels important. A stick found outside can become a treasure. A puddle can become an entire destination. A simple game can create endless laughter. The world is still new. Still exciting. Still full of possibilities. At 2 years old, children are beginning to develop their own personalities. Some become quiet observers. Others become fearless explorers. Some cling closely to familiar adults. Others race ahead with endless confidence. Every child develops differently. Every child reveals unique traits. But all of them share one thing. Potential. Unlimited potential. A future that has not yet been written. That future is what makes the loss of a child so uniquely devastating. When an elderly person dies, Loved ones mourn a life that has been lived. When a child dies, people mourn a life that never had the opportunity to unfold. Every possibility disappears simultaneously. Every future birthday. Every future achievement. Every future friendship. Every future dream. Gone before they have a chance to exist. As the years passed after Nevaeh's death, many people found themselves thinking not only about how she died, but about who she might have become. Would she have loved the ocean that surrounded the Bay of Plenty coastline? Would she have enjoyed school? Would she have become artistic, athletic, adventurous, quiet, determined? No one can answer those questions. The crime ensured that nobody ever would. And that uncertainty carries its own kind of grief. The loss extends beyond the child who existed. It includes the adult she never became. One of the heartbreaking realities of this case is that Nevaeh was too young to leave behind a detailed record of her personality. There are no lengthy interviews. No personal writings. No social media posts. No stories told in her own words. Everything we know comes through the memories of others. Through photographs. Through observations. Through fragments. That is often the case when very young children become victims. Their voices must be reconstructed through the people who knew them. Yet even those fragments matter. Because they remind us that Nevaeh was not merely a name in a court file. She was not simply a victim number. She was a real child. A little girl whose life possessed value independent of the crime that ended it. The legal proceedings that followed her death revealed horrifying details about her final days. Details that would shock New Zealand. Details that would leave experienced investigators, lawyers, and members of the public struggling to comprehend the scale of the violence involved. But before those injuries existed, there was simply a child. A child who depended entirely upon adults. A child whose vulnerability was absolute. Children of that age cannot escape dangerous situations. They cannot report abuse effectively. They cannot explain complex fears. They cannot seek help independently. Their survival depends on the decisions made by the people around them. That dependency is both beautiful and terrifying. Beautiful because it allows children to trust completely. Terrifying because it leaves them defenseless when that trust is broken. As investigators later pieced together the circumstances surrounding Nevaeh's life, they were forced to confront a difficult reality. Every injury documented by forensic experts represented a moment when a child needed protection and did not receive it. Every injury represented vulnerability. Every injury represented a failure somewhere along the chain of care that should have surrounded her. That realization became one of the emotional centers of the case. Because Nevaeh's story was never simply about a murder. It was also about vulnerability. About dependence. About the enormous responsibility society places upon adults to safeguard children. The public reaction reflected that understanding. Many people struggled to discuss the case without expressing anger. Others expressed sorrow. Some focused on addiction. Others focused on family violence. Many focused on the systems responsible for protecting children. Yet beneath all those conversations remained the same undeniable truth. A little girl had lost her life. Nothing could change that. No legal argument. No courtroom verdict. No sentence. No appeal. The justice system could determine accountability. It could impose punishment. It could establish facts. But it could never restore the future that had been taken away. When discussing true crime, there is often a temptation to move quickly toward the mystery. Toward the investigation. Toward the suspect. Toward the shocking revelations. But Nevaeh's story demands a pause. A moment to remember who suffered the greatest loss. Not the investigators. Not the lawyers. Not the journalists. Not even the community. The greatest loss belonged to a child who never had the chance to grow beyond her second year of life. A child who should have been discovering the world. A child who should have been surrounded by safety. A child who should have been protected. Instead, She became the center of a case that would horrify an entire nation. And perhaps the most painful aspect of all is how ordinary her hopes would have been. Children do not dream of extraordinary things at 2 years old. They dream of comfort, of attention, of affection, of feeling safe. The things adults often take for granted are everything to a toddler. A warm embrace, a reassuring voice, a secure place to sleep, the certainty that someone will be there when they cry. These are small things. Yet they are also the foundation of childhood. The foundation upon which every future memory is built. For Nevaeh, that foundation was shattered. And when the events of March 2019 finally unfolded, the consequences would be irreversible. The little girl at the center of this story would never grow older. Never outgrow childhood. Never leave behind memories of her own. What remains instead is a responsibility. A responsibility to remember her not solely for the violence that ended her life, but for the simple truth that existed before any crime occurred. She was a child. She mattered. Her life mattered. And the story of what happened to her is about to enter its darkest chapter. Because in March 2019, concern began spreading through Makatu. Questions began circulating. People started searching for answers. A little girl was missing. And nobody yet understood the horrifying truth that lay hidden beneath the surface. March of 2019 began like countless other months in the Bay of Plenty. The tides continued their endless rhythm. Morning light spread across the coastline. Cars moved along familiar roads. Families followed their routines. For most people, there was nothing unusual about the days passing by. Life continued forward in the quiet, predictable way it often does in small communities. Yet somewhere within that ordinary flow of time, events were unfolding that would soon shock an entire nation. The tragedy at the center of this story did not arrive with sirens. It did not begin with a dramatic public scene. There was no immediate moment when the community collectively realized something terrible had happened. Instead, the truth remained hidden. Concealed behind uncertainty. Concealed behind incomplete information. Concealed behind the fact that those who knew what had occurred were not immediately telling the full story. That silence would become one of the most haunting aspects of the case. Because while the outside world continued moving normally, a 2-year-old child was no longer safe. The final chapter of Nevaeh Age's life unfolded away from public view. No witnesses stepped forward to describe every moment. No recording exists that captures the complete sequence of events. Investigators would later rely on forensic evidence, timelines, expert testimony, and statements gathered throughout the investigation to reconstruct what happened. Even then, some details could never be fully recovered. That is often true in homicide cases. The dead cannot speak. The truth must be assembled from fragments. And those fragments rarely provide a perfect picture. What investigators eventually established was devastating. The violence inflicted upon Nevaeh was not the result of an accident. It was not the result of a brief moment of carelessness. The evidence presented later in court indicated that she suffered extensive injuries before her death. Medical testimony would reveal the shocking scale of those injuries. For experienced professionals accustomed to examining violent crimes, the findings were deeply disturbing. The sheer number of injuries became one of the defining facts of the case. Not because numbers alone tell a story, but because each injury represented suffering. Each injury represented vulnerability. Each injury represented a moment when a child who needed protection instead encountered harm. As prosecutors later argued, the evidence pointed toward an episode of extreme violence. The prosecution's case described actions that went far beyond anything that could reasonably be explained as accidental. Their argument was straightforward. The injuries reflected deliberate acts. The injuries reflected sustained violence. And the injuries reflected a complete disregard for the safety and well-being of a defenseless child. At the center of that accusation stood Nevaeh's father, Aaron Izet. The role of a parent carries immense responsibility. Society grants parents extraordinary trust. Children rely on that trust for survival. Parents are expected to provide food, shelter, comfort, and protection. They are expected to act as guardians against danger. In this case, investigators would eventually conclude that the danger came from the very person who should have been protecting her. That conclusion would become almost impossible for many members of the public to comprehend. Crimes involving strangers are frightening. Crimes involving family members often feel even more disturbing. There is a particular horror in betrayal. A particular horror in realizing that safety itself has been corrupted. As the investigation progressed, prosecutors would advance a theory that methamphetamine played a significant role in the events leading to Nevaeh's death. Methamphetamine has long been associated with severe behavioral disturbances. Heavy use can contribute to paranoia, aggression, impulsivity, emotional instability, and episodes of irrational thinking. The prosecution argued that Aaron Izett was experiencing what they described as a meth-fueled rage during the period surrounding the crime. That allegation would later become a central point of contention. The defense would argue that his mental state had been profoundly affected by drug use. The prosecution would argue that whatever influence drugs may have had, responsibility still rested with the person who committed the acts. Those legal battles belonged to the future. During the events themselves, however, no courtroom existed. No jury was present. No judge was listening. There was only a child and the circumstances surrounding her final hours. The exact atmosphere inside that environment can never be fully known. What was said cannot be completely reconstructed. What thoughts moved through the minds of the people present cannot be established with certainty. Responsible storytelling requires acknowledging those limits. Yet some truths remain undeniable. A 2-year-old child entered those moments completely dependent on the adults around her. She had no ability to escape. No ability to seek outside help. No ability to understand the danger she faced. That reality sits at the heart of the tragedy. The imbalance of power between an adult and a toddler is enormous. One possesses strength, authority, and control. The other possesses trust. Nothing more. At some point during this period, Nevaeh's life came to an end. The evidence later established that drowning was involved in her death. Investigators would ultimately conclude that her body had been placed in an estuary near Little Waihee. The location itself added another layer of sadness to the case. Estuaries are often places of remarkable natural beauty. The meeting point between land and water creates landscapes filled with movement and life. Birds feed along the shoreline. Tides rise and fall. The environment constantly changes with the passing hours. People visit such places to fish, walk, reflect, or simply enjoy the scenery. There is something peaceful about them. Something calming. Yet in this case, the estuary would become associated with loss. The same waters that reflected the sky above would eventually conceal evidence of a terrible crime. According to findings later presented in court, Nevaeh's body had been submerged beneath the water and weighed down with rocks. That fact alone stunned many observers. It suggested not merely a death, but an effort to hide the death. An effort to ensure discovery would be delayed. An effort to separate the victim from those searching for her. The image lingered in public consciousness long after the trial concluded. Not because of sensationalism, but because of what it represented. A deliberate attempt to conceal the truth. And whenever concealment becomes part of a crime, investigators immediately begin asking additional questions. What was the person trying to hide? How much planning occurred? What actions were taken afterward? What story was being presented to others? These questions would soon become central to the investigation. But at the time, the wider community remained unaware of what had happened. People did not yet know the truth. The search for answers had not fully begun. Instead, uncertainty dominated. And uncertainty has a unique power. It creates hope where hope may no longer be justified. It allows loved ones to imagine positive outcomes. It encourages people to believe there is still time. That someone missing may still be found alive. that a misunderstanding may be resolved, that fears may ultimately prove unfounded. Those hopes are often necessary. Without them, the earliest stages of a missing person case would become unbearable. Yet hope can also delay the realization that something much worse has occurred. For those connected to Nevaeh, the coming days would force that realization. For investigators, the challenge would become separating fact from fiction. For the community, the challenge would become accepting a truth more painful than anyone wanted to imagine. The violence itself was horrifying. But another painful reality emerged alongside it. The victim was not old enough to understand why any of it was happening. Adults can sometimes make sense of suffering. Children cannot. A toddler experiences fear in its purest form. Immediate. Confusing. Overwhelming. They do not understand motives. They do not understand addiction. They do not understand mental illness. They do not understand anger. They simply know whether they feel safe. Or whether they do not. That reality would haunt many people who later followed the case. Because every discussion about evidence eventually led back to the same fact. The victim was 2 years old. Not 12. Not 16. 2. The age itself transformed the crime from tragic to almost unimaginable. As news gradually spread and investigators worked to establish the truth, public attention intensified. People wanted answers. People wanted explanations. People wanted to know how such a thing could happen. Yet explanations and excuses are not the same thing. One of the defining tensions of the case would eventually revolve around that distinction. Could drug use explain the behavior? Perhaps. Could drug use excuse the behavior? That became a question for the courts. For now, however, those debates remained in the future. The immediate reality was simpler and far more heartbreaking. A child was gone. The peaceful rhythm of life in Makatu had been shattered. A community stood on the edge of a revelation it did not yet fully understand. And somewhere beneath the waters near Little Waihi, the evidence of a terrible crime waited to be discovered. The truth could remain hidden for only so long. Eventually, every homicide investigation reaches a turning point. A moment when uncertainty begins to collapse. A moment when suspicion gives way to evidence. A moment when investigators stop asking whether a crime has occurred and begin asking who committed it. For the Bay of Plenty community, that moment was approaching. And when it arrived, it would transform a missing child case into one of the most disturbing murder investigations New Zealand had seen in years. Every missing child investigation exists in a fragile space between hope and fear. In the beginning, hope usually wins. It has to. Families cling to it because the alternative is too painful to imagine. Friends repeat it to one another. Volunteers carry it with them during searches. Investigators remain careful not to abandon it prematurely. As long as a child has not been found, there remains the possibility, however small, that the story will end differently. That possibility hung over the Bay of Plenty community as concern about Nevaeh Aja intensified. People searched for explanations. People searched for sightings. People searched for anything that might provide reassurance. A toddler could not simply vanish. Someone had to know something. Someone had to have seen something. Somewhere, there had to be an answer. But as investigators began examining the circumstances surrounding Nevaeh's disappearance, troubling questions started emerging. The timeline was becoming increasingly important. Who had last seen her? When had she last been accounted for? What had happened during the hours before concerns were raised? What explanations were being offered? Every missing person investigation begins with those same questions. They appear simple. In reality, they often determine the entire direction of a case. The first hours are critical because memories remain fresh. People still remember details. Movements can be tracked. Witnesses can be identified. Electronic records can be collected. Small inconsistencies become visible before stories have time to change. As detectives worked through those early stages, the situation began evolving from a search for a missing child into something far more serious. The details available to investigators did not point toward a child who had wandered away. They did not point toward a random disappearance. Instead, attention increasingly focused on the people closest to her. This is a pattern investigators encounter frequently. While public imagination often gravitates toward unknown predators and mysterious strangers, statistics repeatedly show that young children are most often harmed by people already inside their lives. Parents, relatives, caregivers, individuals who have access, individuals who have trust, individuals who are not viewed as threats until evidence suggests otherwise. In Nevaeh's case, that possibility was becoming impossible to ignore. As the investigation expanded, officers began gathering information from multiple sources. Statements were compared. Timelines were reconstructed. Physical evidence was examined. Every detail mattered because every detail had the potential to reveal what had happened to a child who could no longer tell her own story. Then came the moment that changed everything. The moment when uncertainty gave way to reality. The moment when hope collided with evidence. Near Little Waihi, an estuary stretched beneath the open sky. Like countless waterways throughout New Zealand, it appeared calm from a distance. The water moved with the tides. Birds crossed overhead. The landscape possessed the quiet beauty that defines so much of the country's coastline. Nothing about the setting announced what investigators would soon discover. Nothing about the scenery reflected the horror hidden beneath its surface. Yet somewhere within those waters lay the answer everyone had been searching for. When Nevaeh's body was recovered, the missing child investigation instantly transformed into a homicide investigation. The worst possibility had become reality. For investigators, the discovery represented both an ending and a beginning. An ending because the search for a living child was over. A beginning because a murder inquiry had now commenced. The emotional impact of that transition cannot be overstated. Police officers who work crimes involving children often describe such cases as uniquely difficult. Professional training teaches investigators how to remain objective. Evidence must be collected carefully. Facts must guide decisions. Emotions cannot be allowed to interfere with procedure. Yet officers are still human beings. The discovery of a murdered child affects everyone involved. Behind every forensic examination lies a simple truth. A little girl who should have been alive was dead. The condition in which Nevaeh was found added another deeply disturbing element to the investigation. Evidence later presented in court established that her body had been submerged beneath the water and weighed down with rocks. That detail immediately suggested concealment. It suggested that whoever was responsible had taken active steps after her death. Investigators understand the significance of such actions. Crimes committed in moments of sudden violence sometimes leave evidence behind unintentionally. Efforts to conceal a body often indicate additional decisions made after the fatal event itself. Those decisions become important. They reveal behavior. They reveal priorities. They reveal attempts to avoid discovery. As forensic teams processed the recovery scene, every observation became critical. Photographs were taken. Measurements were recorded. Evidence was preserved. Investigators needed to understand not only how Nevaeh had died but also how she had arrived at that location. Questions multiplied rapidly. When had the body been placed there? Who had transported her? What route had been used? What evidence might remain at the original scene? Could physical traces connect a suspect to the disposal site? The discovery had provided answers, but it had also generated an entirely new set of mysteries. Meanwhile, the community was confronting its own grief. The confirmation that Nevaeh had died spread quickly. Small communities often experience tragedies collectively. News travels through families, workplaces, schools, and neighborhoods. People who never personally knew the victim still feel the impact because the loss touches the entire community. In cases involving children, that effect becomes even stronger. Parents look at their own children differently. Grandparents think about their families. Neighbors discuss the case in hushed voices. A shared sense of sadness settles across the community. For many people, the hardest fact to accept was Nevaeh's age. 2 years old. The number continued appearing in news coverage and public discussion because it seemed impossible to ignore. She had barely begun her life. Most people could not reconcile that reality with the violence investigators were describing. As the autopsy process began, the investigation entered another crucial phase. Forensic pathology often provides the voice victims can no longer offer themselves. In homicide cases, the body becomes evidence. Injuries tell a story. Patterns reveal actions. Medical findings establish facts. Those facts may be uncomfortable, disturbing, or heartbreaking, but they are essential. They cut through speculation. They replace rumor with evidence. In Nevaeh's case, the findings would prove devastating. Medical experts documented an extraordinary number of injuries. The evidence indicated extensive violence before death. The scale of those injuries would later become one of the most shocking elements presented during trial proceedings. For investigators, the autopsy findings reinforced an increasingly unavoidable conclusion. This was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a case of uncertainty. Someone had inflicted severe harm upon a defenseless child. And someone would need to answer for it. The discovery also altered the tone of the investigation itself. Detectives were no longer searching broadly for possibilities. Their focus narrowed. They began concentrating on identifying who had both the opportunity and the ability to commit the crime. As that process unfolded, attention increasingly centered on Aaron Izett, the father of the victim. Even years later, that fact remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Human beings are conditioned to view parents as protectors. The expectation is deeply rooted in society. It exists across cultures and generations. When a parent becomes the source of danger instead, the emotional shock is profound. Investigators understood that public reaction would be intense if the evidence ultimately pointed in that direction. Yet their responsibility was not to follow emotion. Their responsibility was to follow facts. And the facts were beginning to align. Timelines. Statements. Forensic evidence. Behavior. Every new piece of information helped clarify the picture. The discovery at Little Weihea had not solved the case completely. But it had illuminated the path forward. The truth was no longer hidden beneath uncertainty. It was now hidden within evidence. And evidence, when examined carefully enough, has a way of speaking. As detectives continued assembling the case, the questions became more focused. Not whether Nevaeh had been murdered. Not whether her death involved criminal actions. Those questions had largely been answered. The central question now was who would be held responsible. The answer would emerge through painstaking investigation. Through interviews. Through forensic analysis. Through contradictions that could not be explained away. And through a growing body of evidence that pointed investigators toward a conclusion more horrifying than anyone had initially imagined. The recovery of Nevaeh's body marked the moment when hope ended. But it also marked the moment when accountability became possible. The child who could no longer speak would now be represented by evidence. And that evidence was leading detectives toward the person they increasingly believed had committed the crime. The investigation was about to enter its most critical stage. The search for a missing child was over. The hunt for a killer had begun. Once investigators confirmed that Nevaeh Age's death was the result of homicide, the nature of the case changed completely. The search was over. The uncertainty surrounding whether a crime had occurred was over. The question now was far more direct. Who was responsible? In many murder investigations, detectives begin with a wide field of possibilities. They examine strangers, acquaintances, known offenders, recent sightings, unexplained movements, and countless other leads. Entire teams can spend months chasing possibilities that ultimately lead nowhere. But child homicide investigations often follow a different pattern. Investigators understand a difficult reality supported by decades of criminal research. When very young children become victims of fatal violence, the offender is frequently someone already within the child's immediate circle. Someone trusted. Someone familiar. Someone with access. Someone who would not initially appear suspicious to outsiders. That understanding does not allow investigators to jump to conclusions. Every case still requires evidence. Every theory still requires proof. Every allegation still requires verification. Yet it does influence where detectives begin looking. And in the case of Nevaeh Ager, the evidence was increasingly directing attention toward the people closest to her. The investigative process unfolded methodically. Detectives reconstructed timelines. They reviewed statements. They compared accounts given by different individuals. They searched for inconsistencies. They examined movements before and after Nevaeh disappeared. Every hour mattered. Every interaction mattered. Every unexplained gap mattered. One of the most important aspects of any homicide investigation is establishing chronology. Investigators need to know not only what happened but when it happened. A timeline creates structure. Without it, facts remain disconnected. With it, patterns emerge. The challenge is that people do not always tell the truth. Some lie intentionally. Some lie to protect themselves. Some lie to protect others. Some misremember events. Some alter details after learning new information. As a result, detectives rarely accept statements at face value. They compare them against evidence. Against witness accounts. Against forensic findings. Against objective records whenever possible. Truth tends to remain consistent. Falsehoods often require constant adjustment. As detectives continued building their timeline, certain explanations became increasingly difficult to reconcile with the available evidence. Questions lingered. Questions about where Nevaeh had been. Questions about what had happened before her disappearance. Questions about injuries. Questions about behavior. Questions about actions taken after her death. Those questions gradually narrowed the investigative focus. Meanwhile, forensic evidence continued providing critical information. The autopsy findings had already established that Nevaeh suffered extensive injuries. That fact alone dramatically altered the direction of the investigation. A child does not accumulate dozens of injuries through a simple accident. The sheer number of documented injuries pointed investigators toward a conclusion that became harder to avoid with every passing day. This had been an act of extreme violence. And extreme violence leaves traces. Not always obvious traces. Not always physical traces. But traces nonetheless. Behavior changes. Stories change. People react differently under pressure. Detectives pay close attention to those reactions. Not because unusual behavior automatically proves guilt. It does not. People respond to trauma in different ways. Some become emotional. Some become detached. Some become confused. Some become angry. Behavior alone is never enough. But behavior combined with evidence can become significant. As investigators worked through interviews and evidence reviews, Aaron Izett increasingly became the central focus of the case. The father of the victim. The man who should have represented safety. The man who should have represented protection. The man investigators now believed might have been responsible for one of the most disturbing crimes the region had seen in years. Cases involving parents often create unique investigative challenges. Emotions run high. Public reaction can be intense. People naturally resist the idea that a parent could inflict catastrophic harm upon their own child. The concept feels fundamentally wrong. It violates expectations that most people carry throughout their lives. Parents protect. Parents comfort. Parents sacrifice. When evidence suggests the opposite, disbelief often follows. Investigators are trained to move beyond disbelief. Their responsibility is not to determine what feels emotionally acceptable. Their responsibility is to determine what the evidence supports. And increasingly, the evidence appeared to support a deeply troubling conclusion. As attention centered on Aaron Izett, another important element emerged. Methamphetamine. Throughout New Zealand, law enforcement agencies have spent years confronting the consequences of methamphetamine abuse. The drug's effects can be devastating. Families collapse. Relationships deteriorate. Violence escalates. Users often experience paranoia, agitation, sleep deprivation, impulsive behavior, and severe emotional instability. The social damage extends far beyond individual users. Entire communities can feel the impact. Entire generations can feel the impact. Children often become the invisible victims. Not because they use the drug, because they live in environments shaped by it. Investigators examining the circumstances surrounding Nevaeh's death soon found themselves confronting that reality. The role methamphetamine played would eventually become one of the most fiercely debated aspects of the entire case. But during the investigation, detectives were not primarily interested in philosophical questions about addiction. They were interested in evidence. What happened? Who did it? What can be proven? Those remained the central concerns. As detectives pushed deeper into the case, the possibility of alternative suspects became increasingly difficult to sustain. Every homicide investigation must consider alternatives. Investigators have a duty to challenge their own assumptions. Tunnel vision can destroy cases. Good detectives actively test competing explanations. Could someone else have been responsible? Could another person have had access? Could another theory explain the evidence? Those questions must be examined thoroughly. Yet sometimes the process of eliminating alternatives strengthens the original conclusion. Each discarded possibility leaves the remaining explanation standing more firmly. That appeared to be happening here. The more evidence investigators gathered, the more their attention remained fixed on the same individual. Aaron Izett. For members of the public following the case, the investigation produced a growing sense of dread. People were no longer asking whether a crime had occurred. That answer was already known. The questions had become far more personal. How could a father become the primary suspect in the murder of his own child? What circumstances could lead to such a tragedy? What had happened behind closed doors? What warning signs might have existed before the violence reached its final and irreversible conclusion? These questions echoed throughout the community. Some focused on addiction. Some focused on family violence. Some focused on broader social failures. Others focused entirely on accountability. Yet investigators remained focused on a narrower objective: building a prosecutable case. The standard required in a criminal investigation is not suspicion. It is proof. Suspicion may guide inquiries. Proof secures convictions. Every document collected. Every witness interviewed. Every forensic conclusion reviewed. Every timeline reconstructed. All of it served one purpose: establishing what could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. That process takes time. Television dramas often portray investigations as rapid sequences of breakthroughs and dramatic confrontations. Reality is slower, more methodical, more frustrating. Detectives spend countless hours reviewing information that leads nowhere. They revisit details repeatedly. They challenge assumptions. They search for inconsistencies. Progress often arrives in small increments rather than dramatic revelations. The investigation into Nevaeh's death was no different. Behind the scenes, investigators continued assembling piece after piece of the puzzle. And gradually, the picture became clearer. The injuries. The circumstances surrounding her disappearance. The recovery of her body. The evidence indicating concealment. The statements gathered during the investigation. Together they formed a narrative. A narrative detectives believed pointed directly toward Aaron Izett. Eventually, the investigation reached a stage where authorities felt confident enough to proceed. The evidence had moved beyond suspicion. The focus shifted toward prosecution, toward presenting the case before a jury, toward testing the conclusions reached by investigators against the highest standard required in criminal law. Yet even as the case advanced, one major question remained unresolved. How would Aaron Izett explain what had happened? That question would soon become central, because the defense that eventually emerged would not focus primarily on denying that a death had occurred. Instead, it would focus on mental state, on methamphetamine, on responsibility, on whether severe drug-induced impairment could affect criminal accountability. Those arguments were still ahead. For now, investigators had completed the difficult task of transforming tragedy into evidence. The little girl whose life had ended could no longer speak. But the evidence spoke for her. The injuries spoke. The forensic findings spoke. The timeline spoke. And together they told a story investigators believed would withstand scrutiny in court. The hunt for a killer was nearing its conclusion. The next phase would be fought not in search areas or interview rooms, but inside a courtroom. And there, every piece of evidence collected during the investigation would face its ultimate test. Every major criminal investigation eventually reaches a moment when the fog begins to lift. The unanswered questions that once seemed endless begin narrowing toward a single conclusion. Separate pieces of evidence stop looking like isolated fragments and start fitting together. Investigators no longer spend most of their time asking what happened. Instead, they begin asking how they can prove it. For the detectives working the death of Nevaeh Aja, that moment did not arrive through a dramatic confession or a single miraculous discovery. It emerged through the slow accumulation of evidence, piece by piece, detail by detail, until the picture became impossible to ignore. The breakthrough was not one fact. It was the convergence of many facts. The recovery of Nevaeh's body, the forensic findings, the documented injuries, the circumstances surrounding her disappearance, the evidence indicating concealment, the timelines established by investigators, the behavior of those closest to her. Together they formed a narrative that increasingly pointed toward one person. Aaron Izett, the child's father. The same person who should have represented safety in her life. As the investigation matured, detectives moved from gathering information to testing conclusions. Every theory had to survive scrutiny. Every assumption had to be challenged. Every possibility had to be examined. Good investigators understand that certainty can be dangerous. Cases are not won by intuition. They are won by evidence. The question was no longer whether detectives suspected Aaron Izett. The question was whether the evidence would support that suspicion in court. That distinction mattered enormously. Criminal courts demand proof. Public opinion may form quickly. Jurors cannot. The burden rests on the prosecution to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Detectives knew that everything they had gathered would eventually face intense examination. Defense lawyers would challenge interpretations. Experts would debate conclusions. Every weakness would be exposed. Every gap would be explored. Every uncertainty would be magnified. That reality forced investigators to examine their own case relentlessly before anyone else had the opportunity. As they continued doing so, the evidence remained remarkably consistent. The forensic findings proved especially important. Physical evidence often becomes the strongest witness in homicide cases because it has no motive to lie. It does not forget. It does not change its story. It simply exists. And what the physical evidence revealed about Nevaeh's final period of life was deeply disturbing. The injuries documented by forensic experts painted a picture of extensive violence. Not a single act. Not a minor incident. Not an accident. The scale of the injuries suggested repeated harm inflicted upon a child who was utterly defenseless. For investigators, those findings significantly narrowed the range of plausible explanations. The more experts examined the evidence, the harder it became to imagine any innocent interpretation. This was one of the moments when the investigation began transitioning from uncertainty to confidence. Confidence not in the emotional sense. Confidence in the evidentiary sense. The evidence was speaking clearly, and investigators were listening. At the same time, attention increasingly turned toward Aaron Izette's state of mind during the period surrounding the crime. This would become one of the most important themes in the entire case. Methamphetamine. Again and again, investigators encountered references to drug use. Again and again, questions arose about its role. Again and again, the issue resurfaced. Methamphetamine is not merely a narcotic. In heavy users, it can become a destructive force that reshapes behavior, perception, judgment, and impulse control. Long periods without sleep can intensify psychological instability. Paranoia can emerge. Delusions can develop. Aggression can escalate. Reality itself can become distorted. Investigators understood these effects. Courts understood these effects. Medical experts understood these effects. The challenge was determining exactly how those effects fit into the events surrounding Nevaeh's death. That question would eventually become central to the defense. But before it became a courtroom argument, it existed as an investigative consideration. Detectives needed to determine whether drug use explained the violence. More importantly, they needed to determine whether it altered responsibility for the violence. Those are not identical questions. One concerns cause. The other concerns accountability. The distinction would later become crucial. As investigators continued assembling their case, another element strengthened their conclusions. The apparent efforts to conceal Nevaeh's body. This aspect carried significant weight. Jurors often pay close attention to actions taken after a crime because such actions can reveal consciousness of guilt. People who accidentally cause harm generally seek assistance. People who discover unexpected tragedies often call emergency services. People who believe they have done nothing wrong rarely hide evidence. Investigators therefore viewed the disposal of Nevaeh's body as a critical piece of the puzzle. The body had not simply been left where death occurred. According to evidence presented later in court, it had been placed in an estuary and weighed down beneath the water. That suggested deliberate action. Deliberate action after the fatal events themselves. And every deliberate action created additional questions. What was the purpose? What was the intention? What was the individual hoping to accomplish? The answers detectives arrived at were deeply troubling. Concealment implied awareness. Awareness implied understanding. Understanding implied responsibility. Each inference strengthened the overall case. As weeks turned into months, the investigation reached a stage where the broad outlines of the crime were becoming increasingly clear. There would always be uncertainties. There would always be details that could never be reconstructed perfectly. But the central narrative had emerged. Nevaeh had suffered extensive violence. She had died. Her body had been hidden. And the evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward her father. The breakthrough was complete. The investigation had found its answer. Yet in many ways, this was only the beginning. Because proving a case in court requires more than evidence. It requires a narrative capable of surviving attack. And attacks were coming. As preparations for trial intensified, Aaron Izette's defense strategy began to take shape. The defense would not simply focus on denying responsibility. Instead, it would center on mental state. On methamphetamine. On the argument that severe drug-induced impairment had fundamentally altered his capacity to understand his actions. This distinction would become one of the most closely watched aspects of the case. The defense position, broadly speaking, was that Aaron Izette's mental functioning had been profoundly disrupted by methamphetamine use. According to this argument, he was experiencing a state so extreme that his understanding of reality had been compromised. His recollection of events was disputed. His awareness was disputed. His responsibility, according to the defense, should therefore be viewed through the lens of severe drug-induced psychological disturbance. The prosecution saw matters very differently. For prosecutors, The evidence did not point toward a person incapable of understanding reality. It pointed toward a person who had committed murder. A person whose actions before, during, and after the crime demonstrated responsibility. A person who had made choices. A person who had attempted to conceal those choices. The collision between these two interpretations would eventually unfold before a jury. But even before trial began, investigators had already spent months confronting those questions. And the conclusions they reached were reflected in the charges that followed. By this stage, public attention had intensified dramatically. The case had already generated widespread outrage. Every new detail increased that outrage. Every mention of Nevaeh's age renewed public grief. Every discussion of the injuries deepened public horror. The fact that the accused was her father only amplified those reactions. Across New Zealand, people struggled to understand how such a crime could occur. Many searched for broader explanations. Some focused on methamphetamine. Some focused on family violence. Some focused on child protection systems. Others focused exclusively on individual accountability. The discussions varied. The emotions varied. But one sentiment remained remarkably consistent. People wanted justice for Nevaeh. Investigators, however, remained focused on a narrower objective. Emotion alone could not secure a conviction. Evidence could. The months spent building the case had been devoted to that principle. Every interview, every forensic examination, every document review, every timeline reconstruction, all of it had served a single purpose: preparing for the moment when the evidence would be tested before a jury. That moment was approaching. And as it approached, detectives could finally look back and recognize how far the case had come. What began as concern over a missing toddler had evolved into one of the most disturbing homicide investigations in recent New Zealand history. The child who had vanished was no longer missing. The truth about her death had emerged. The individual investigators believed responsible had been identified. The breakthrough had arrived. Now the justice system would decide what happened next. The next chapter would unfold beneath courtroom lights rather than investigative spotlights. Lawyers would argue. Experts would testify. Jurors would listen. And the story of Nevaeh Ager would move toward its final legal reckoning. The investigation had uncovered the truth as detectives understood it. The challenge now was convincing 12 strangers beyond reasonable doubt. And that challenge would determine whether accountability finally followed tragedy. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the investigation had already revealed enough facts to shock New Zealand. A 2-year-old child was dead. Her body had been recovered from an estuary near Little Waihi. Forensic evidence had documented extensive injuries. The investigation had identified Aaron Izett, her father, as the person responsible. Yet in a criminal justice system, even the strongest investigative conclusions must survive a final test. Evidence must be presented. Arguments must be challenged. Witnesses must be examined. And ultimately, a jury must decide whether the prosecution has proven its case beyond reasonable doubt. That process exists for a reason. Courts are not designed to confirm suspicions. They are designed to evaluate evidence. No matter how emotional a case may be, the standard remains the same. The accused enters the courtroom presumed innocent. The burden rests entirely upon the prosecution. In the case of Nevaeh Ager, however, the emotional weight hanging over the proceedings was impossible to ignore. This was not simply another homicide trial. This was the trial of a man accused of murdering his own 2-year-old daughter. Every person present understood the gravity of that accusation. Every person present understood that the evidence would be difficult to hear. And every person present understood that the verdict would carry consequences extending far beyond a single courtroom. As the proceedings unfolded, prosecutors began presenting the story investigators had spent months constructing. Piece by piece, they guided jurors through the evidence. The timeline. The circumstances surrounding Nevaeh's disappearance. The recovery of her body. The forensic findings. The injuries. The concealment. Each element formed part of a larger picture. The prosecution's task was straightforward in principle, though emotionally devastating in practice. They needed to demonstrate that Aaron Izett had murdered his daughter. Not accidentally. Not unintentionally. Murdered. To accomplish that, prosecutors relied heavily upon forensic evidence. In homicide cases, forensic evidence often provides some of the most compelling testimony because it is rooted in physical reality. Witnesses may forget. Witnesses may lie. Physical evidence remains. And the physical evidence in this case was deeply disturbing. Medical experts described the injuries discovered during examination. The findings painted a picture of extraordinary violence. Jurors learned that Nevaeh had suffered approximately 70 to 80 injuries before her death. The number itself carried enormous emotional force. Not because numbers automatically create horror, but because each injury represented a separate indication of harm. Each injury represented vulnerability. Each injury represented a moment in which a child who needed protection instead encountered violence. The courtroom was forced to confront a reality almost impossible to reconcile with ordinary human expectations. The victim was 2 years old. A toddler. A child entirely dependent upon adults. A child incapable of defending herself. As forensic testimony continued, prosecutors argued that the injuries were consistent with extreme violence inflicted upon a defenseless victim. The evidence did not support a simple accident. The evidence did not support a misunderstanding. The evidence pointed toward intentional acts. And those acts, according to prosecutors, culminated in murder. The prosecution also focused on the circumstances surrounding the disposal of Nevaeh's body. This aspect of the case carried significant legal importance. Actions taken after a crime can reveal state of mind. They can demonstrate awareness. They can reveal attempts to avoid detection. According to the evidence presented, Nevaeh's body had been submerged beneath water and weighed down with rocks. Prosecutors argued that such conduct reflected deliberate efforts to conceal what had occurred. The significance of that argument extended beyond the physical act itself. If the jury accepted that concealment occurred, they would naturally be forced to consider what motivated it. Why hide a body if no crime had been committed? Why attempt to prevent discovery? Why create distance between investigators and the truth? The prosecution believed the answer was obvious. Because the person responsible knew exactly what had happened. And that person was Aaron Izett. Yet every criminal trial contains two sides. The defense was not required to prove innocence. The defense was not required to provide a complete alternative explanation. Its role was to challenge the prosecution's conclusions and raise reasonable doubt wherever possible. In this case, the defense strategy centered heavily on mental state. Methamphetamine became the focal point. Aaron Izett maintained that his psychological condition at the time of the offense had been profoundly affected by drug use. According to the defense position, methamphetamine had driven him into a state of severe mental disturbance. His perception of reality, they argued, had been dramatically compromised. His understanding of events had been impaired. His recollection of what occurred was incomplete. The defense advanced the argument that he was not criminally responsible in the way prosecutors alleged because his mental functioning had been overwhelmed by the effects of methamphetamine. This argument introduced one of the most difficult questions in criminal law. At what point does mental impairment affect responsibility? The question has challenged courts for generations. Mental illness, psychosis, substance-induced disorders, delusions. These issues often exist within complex legal frameworks that attempt to balance compassion with accountability. The challenge becomes even greater when severe drug use enters the picture. The courtroom now found itself confronting that challenge directly. Expert witnesses became crucial. Medical professionals explained the effects methamphetamine can have on users. Jurors heard evidence regarding psychological disturbances associated with prolonged use. The defense sought to establish that Aronizette's mental state had deteriorated so significantly that ordinary concepts of responsibility should not apply. The prosecution disagreed strongly. Prosecutors acknowledged the existence of drug use, but they argued that drug use did not erase responsibility. More importantly, they argued that the evidence demonstrated awareness and intentional conduct. The concealment of the body, the actions following the crime, the circumstances surrounding the death. Together, prosecutors argued, these facts showed that Aronizette understood what he had done. The jury's task was not easy. They were being asked to evaluate deeply disturbing evidence while simultaneously navigating complicated legal questions about mental state and accountability. Yet at the heart of the case remained a simple reality. A 2-year-old child was dead. Nothing presented in court could change that fact. Nothing could restore the life that had been lost. The legal system could only determine responsibility. After hearing the evidence, jurors reached their conclusion. They rejected the defense argument. They rejected the claim that Aronizette should not be held criminally responsible because of his mental state. And they found him guilty of murder. For many observers, the verdict represented the culmination of a long and painful process. The investigation had identified a suspect. The evidence had been tested. The jury had spoken. Yet another important stage still remained. Sentencing. A guilty verdict establishes responsibility. A sentence determines consequences. When sentencing finally arrived, the court confronted one of the most serious crimes recognized under New Zealand law. Murder. And not merely murder. The murder of a 2-year-old child. The sentencing hearing forced everyone involved to revisit the facts one final time. The age of the victim. The severity of the injuries. The circumstances of the death. The disposal of the body. Each factor carried enormous weight. Courts are required to consider numerous factors when imposing sentences. The seriousness of the offense. The vulnerability of the victim. The conduct of the offender. The need for accountability. The need for deterrence. The need to protect society. In this case, the court viewed the crime as exceptionally serious. The victim's extreme vulnerability played a major role in that assessment. So did the violence involved. So did the circumstances surrounding the concealment of the body. When the sentence was ultimately delivered, Aronizette received life imprisonment. For the most serious murders, life imprisonment represents the strongest punishment available within New Zealand's justice system. Yet even within life sentences, courts must determine how long an offender must remain imprisoned before becoming eligible to seek parole. That decision became another critical moment in the case. The court imposed a minimum non-parole period of 17 years. The reasoning reflected the extraordinary seriousness of the crime. The court concluded that the circumstances justified a substantial period of imprisonment before any possibility of parole consideration. For Nevaeh's family and for many members of the public, the sentence represented an important step toward accountability. Not closure. Cases involving murdered children rarely produce true closure. Some losses are too profound. Some absences never stop hurting. But accountability matters. It matters because it establishes responsibility. It matters because it affirms the value of the victim's life. It matters because society must respond when its most vulnerable members are harmed. Even after sentencing, however, the legal process was not entirely over. Years later, Aronizette challenged part of the sentence. He sought to reduce the 17-year minimum period before parole eligibility. The appeal forced courts to revisit aspects of the case once again. Appellate judges reviewed the arguments. They examined the original sentencing decision. They considered whether the punishment imposed had been appropriate. Ultimately, the appeal failed. The Court of Appeal rejected the challenge. The original sentence remained in place. The judges concluded that the seriousness of the crime justified the sentence that had been imposed. With that decision, one of the final major legal chapters in the case came to an end. The verdict remained. The sentence remained. The appeal failed. The justice system had reached its conclusion. But while courts can conclude proceedings, they cannot erase consequences. The legal battle was over. The human cost remained. And long after the courtroom emptied, one reality continued to overshadow everything else. A little girl named Nevaeh Ager never came home. Long after the courtroom doors closed, long after the final appeal was rejected, and long after the headlines gradually disappeared from national attention, the story of Nevaeh Ager continued to linger. That is the reality of tragedies involving children. The legal process eventually ends. The media moves on. Public attention shifts elsewhere. But the absence remains. An empty space continues to exist where a life should have been. For the people closest to the loss, there is no clear finish line. No moment when grief officially concludes. No date on a calendar when the pain becomes history. Life continues, but it continues differently. And in cases like this one, the impact extends far beyond a single family. Entire communities carry scars. Entire regions remember. Entire countries are forced to confront uncomfortable questions. The death of Nevaeh Ager became one of those moments for New Zealand. Not simply because the crime was shocking. Not simply because the victim was so young. But because the case exposed several difficult realities simultaneously. Family violence. Drug addiction. Child vulnerability. Mental health concerns. Systemic challenges. Each of these issues existed before March 2019. Each continued afterward. But the case forced many people to look at them more closely. In the years following the murder, discussions surrounding methamphetamine remained particularly intense. Throughout New Zealand, communities have struggled with the consequences of the drug for decades. The damage extends far beyond those who consume it. Children often become collateral victims. Relationships collapse. Homes become unstable. Trust disappears. Financial hardship increases. Violence becomes more common. What makes these situations especially tragic is that children have no ability to remove themselves from the environment. Adults can leave. Children cannot. Adults can seek help. Children depend on someone else to seek help for them. Adults can recognize danger. Children often cannot. That imbalance creates vulnerability. And vulnerability requires protection. The story of Nevaeh became, in many ways, a reminder of how fragile that protection can sometimes be. One of the most haunting aspects of the case is that the victim was too young to understand the forces shaping her world. She did not understand addiction. She did not understand criminal responsibility. She did not understand the legal arguments that would later unfold inside a courtroom. She did not understand why adults were making the choices they made. She simply existed within the environment created by those adults. That truth sits at the center of many child homicide cases. Children inherit circumstances they never chose. They inherit the consequences of decisions made by others. Sometimes those circumstances are loving and supportive. Sometimes they are chaotic and dangerous. The child has no control over which reality they receive. That dependence creates a profound moral obligation. Adults must be guardians. Communities must be attentive. Institutions must be effective. And when those protections fail, the consequences can be irreversible. As years passed, another aspect of the case continued generating reflection. The relationship between addiction and accountability. This question emerged repeatedly throughout the trial and appeal process. How should society respond when severe drug use contributes to catastrophic violence? Can addiction explain behavior? Certainly. Can addiction excuse behavior? Many people would argue no. The distinction is important. Explanation and justification are not the same thing. Understanding why something happened does not mean accepting it. Recognizing contributing factors does not erase responsibility. The courts ultimately concluded that Aaron Izett remained responsible for his actions. The jury rejected the defense arguments concerning criminal responsibility. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the offense. The appeal court later upheld that judgment. Legally, the answer was clear. Morally, however, broader questions remained. What interventions might have prevented the tragedy? What warning signs existed? Were opportunities missed? Could anyone have recognized the danger sooner? These questions arise after almost every major child homicide. Sometimes there are obvious answers. Sometimes there are none. Human beings naturally search for turning points. Moments where a different decision might have changed everything. A phone call. A report. An intervention. A conversation. A choice. We search for these moments because they create the illusion that tragedy is always predictable. The reality is often more complicated. Sometimes warning signs are obvious. Sometimes they are subtle. Sometimes people notice concerns but lack enough information to understand the severity. Sometimes systems become overwhelmed. Sometimes individuals fall through cracks that nobody realizes exist until it is too late. The uncomfortable truth is that prevention is easier to discuss in hindsight than in real time. That does not mean society should stop trying. If anything, cases like Nevaeh's demonstrate why vigilance matters. Why child welfare matters. Why community awareness matters. Why addiction treatment matters. Why intervention matters. Every lesson extracted from a tragedy represents an attempt to prevent another one. Whether those lessons succeed depends on what happens afterward. For many observers, the image that remains most powerful is not connected to the courtroom. It is not connected to the sentence. It is not connected to legal arguments. It is the image of a child. A 2-year-old girl whose life ended before it truly began. When discussing homicide statistics, it is easy to become detached. Numbers create distance. One child. One case. One conviction. One sentence. But every statistic contains a human story. Every victim possessed a future. Every victim mattered to someone. Every victim occupied a unique place in the world. Nevaeh was no exception. One of the greatest dangers in true crime storytelling is allowing the offender to become more memorable than the victim. The details of a crime naturally attract attention. Violence attracts attention. Trials attract attention. Offenders attract attention. Meanwhile, the victim gradually fades into the background. Yet the victim is the reason the story matters in the first place. Without remembering that fact, true crime risks becoming something hollow. The purpose of examining cases like this should never be fascination with violence alone. The purpose should be understanding. Understanding what happened. Understanding why it happened. Understanding how similar tragedies might be prevented. And remembering the people whose lives were lost. That is especially important when the victim is a child. Children rarely leave behind extensive records of who they were. They do not publish memoirs. They do not build careers. They do not create decades of memories. What remains are fragments. Photographs. Stories. Moments remembered by others. The responsibility for remembering them therefore falls to those left behind. As the years continue passing, Nevaeh will forever remain 2 years old in the public memory. She will never grow older. Never reach adolescence. Never become an adult. Never discover what kind of person she might have become. The future available to most children was taken from her. That reality cannot be changed by any court ruling. No sentence can restore it. No appeal can alter it. Justice systems can punish offenders. They cannot recreate lost futures. And perhaps that is the deepest sadness at the heart of this story. Not simply the violence. Not simply the betrayal. Not simply the criminal act itself. But the magnitude of what disappeared. A lifetime. An entire lifetime. A future filled with experiences that will never occur. A voice that will never mature. A story that ended before it had the chance to unfold. The Bay of Plenty coastline still looks much the same today. The tides still move through the estuaries. The wind still crosses the water. The horizon still stretches endlessly toward the distance. Visitors continue to see beauty there. Families continue to build memories there. Children continue to play there. Life continues. It always does. Yet for those who remember the case, the landscape carries an additional layer of meaning. A reminder that tragedy can exist even in beautiful places. A reminder that danger does not always come from strangers. A reminder that vulnerability deserves protection. A reminder that children depend entirely upon the adults around them. And perhaps most importantly, a reminder that every child matters. Not because of what they may someday become. Not because of achievements they might accomplish. Not because of the headlines their deaths generate. But because their lives possess value from the very beginning. Nevaeh Ager's story is painful. It is disturbing. It is difficult to hear. Yet it remains important. Because behind every court file and every criminal proceeding was a little girl whose life mattered. A little girl who should have been protected. A little girl who deserved the chance to grow up. And although justice ultimately identified the person responsible for taking that future away, the greatest lesson of this case lies elsewhere. It lies in remembering the human cost. The cost measured not in years of imprisonment. Not in legal arguments. Not in appeals. But in birthdays never celebrated. Dreams never realized. Memories never created. And a childhood that ended far too soon. That is where this story truly begins and ends. With Nevaeh. Not as a case number. Not as evidence. Not as a headline. But as a child whose brief life continues to remind us why protecting the most vulnerable among us remains one of society's greatest responsibilities. In the years after the case closed in court, there were no dramatic final chapters left to unfold. No unexpected reversals. No last-minute revelations that changed the outcome. The legal system had reached its conclusion. Aaron Izett remained convicted. The sentence remained in place. The appeal had been dismissed. On paper, the case was finished. But life does not operate on the same timeline as the justice system. For those who followed the story closely, especially those within New Zealand, the case of Nevaeh Ager did not simply end. It slowly settled into collective memory in a different form. Not as breaking news, not as courtroom drama, but as something quieter and more permanent. A reference point for conversations about child safety, addiction, and family violence. Over time, the details that once dominated headlines began to fade for the general public. That is the natural rhythm of news cycles. New cases emerge. New events demand attention. New tragedies replace old ones in the public conversation. Yet certain cases resist full disappearance. They linger. They resurface whenever similar patterns appear elsewhere. Whenever another child is harmed. Whenever another investigation begins in similar circumstances. Whenever society is forced once again to ask uncomfortable questions about protection, responsibility, and prevention. Nevaeh's name became part of that wider, ongoing dialogue. Not as an isolated story, but as part of a pattern people try to understand but never fully resolve. For the justice system, the case became one more entry in a long record of child homicide prosecutions, analyzed for legal principles, sentencing standards, and evidentiary considerations. For investigators, it became a reminder of how quickly a missing child case can shift into a homicide investigation, and how critical the early hours of an inquiry truly are. For the community, it became something else entirely. A moment that changed how people think about safety in spaces that are assumed to be safe. Homes. Families. Trusted relationships. Those are supposed to be the foundations of childhood security. When that assumption is broken, it leaves a psychological imprint that does not easily disappear. Perhaps the most enduring impact of cases like this is not visible in statistics or legal records. It appears in behavior. In caution. In awareness. In the way people talk about children's safety. In the way communities respond to signs of instability. In the way professionals approach risk. In the way society continues to struggle with preventing harm before it occurs. There is also the more difficult question that never receives a complete answer. Could this have been prevented? That question often returns in child homicide cases. It is asked in inquiries. It is asked in conversations. It is asked in private reflection. Sometimes the answer points to missed opportunities. Sometimes it points to systemic failures. Sometimes it points to warning signs that were not understood in time. And sometimes it points to the harsh reality that even when warning signs exist, they do not always lead to intervention that arrives quickly enough. In Nevaeh's case, those questions remain part of the legacy, but they do not change the outcome. What remains unchanged is the fact that a child's life was lost. What remains unchanged is the responsibility to learn from it. What remains unchanged is the obligation to try to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Over time, public memory of true crime cases often becomes simplified. A name, a date, a sentence. But behind those simplified references is always a full human reality that cannot be compressed without loss. Nevaeh Ager was not defined by the circumstances of her death. She was a child who existed before any crime occurred. A child who experienced the world in small, ordinary ways. A child whose life should have expanded outward with time. That future never arrived. And that absence is the most lasting element of the entire story. There is a tendency in true crime to search for resolution in punishment. To believe that once a conviction is delivered and a sentence imposed, the emotional weight of a case can be closed. But justice, while essential, is not the same as restoration. It does not undo harm. It does not return what was lost. It does not repair the space left behind. What it can do is establish accountability. What it can do is affirm societal boundaries. What it can do is acknowledge wrongdoing in a formal and permanent way. And what it can do, perhaps most importantly, is provide a record that ensures the victim is not forgotten. As time continues to pass, Nevaeh's story will likely be revisited in different contexts. Legal discussions, social discussions, training materials for professionals, community awareness conversations. Each retelling will carry a different emphasis, but the central truth will remain unchanged. A very young child was killed. The circumstances were investigated. A jury reached a verdict. The justice system imposed a sentence. And society continues to reflect on what that case reveals about vulnerability, addiction, and responsibility. But beyond all analysis, beyond all discussion, beyond all legal framing, there is a simpler truth that no amount of time can alter. A life ended far too early, and a future that never had the chance to begin. That is where the story ultimately rests. Not in the courtroom. Not in the investigation files. Not in the appeals. But in the absence left behind. A silence that continues to speak long after the case itself has closed. And a reminder that the smallest lives often leave the largest echoes.